Welcome to this week's online study. This is only the third in our series, so if it's your first time, I'm glad you're here. And I would invite you to watch the introductory video that is on the church's webpage. It's not on the Facebook page. So you get an idea of how these are put together. And if you were here last week or the first week, glad you're back. I would also encourage you to be very generous with your comments, either on the Facebook page or on the website, to provide suggestions on how you think this study could be made more meaningful and more useful to you. And I don't want to be a nag, but I want to remind you that this study is built with the expectation that there are at least two of you on the other side of the screen, and I can't see if there are. I trust there are at least two of you there, because this study is built to be a conversation around the Scriptures. The Gospel for October 12th is yet one more parable and a continuation of the still very contentious conversation that Jesus is having with the religious leaders of his day, a parable that indicts them again for their failure to provide the leadership that God's people have really needed. Here's the passage. Matthew 22, 1 through 14. Once more Jesus spoke to them in parables, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding banquet for his son. He sent his slaves to call those who had been invited to the wedding banquet, but they would not come. Again, he sent other slaves, saying, 'Tell those who have been invited, look, I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and my fat calves have been slaughtered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding banquet.' But they made light of it and went away, one to his farm, another to his business, while the rest seized his slaves, mistreated them, and killed them. The king was enraged. He sent his troops, destroyed those murderers, and burned their city. Then he said to his slaves, 'The wedding is ready, but those invited were not worthy. Go therefore into the main streets and invite every one you find to the wedding banquet.' Those slaves went out into the streets and gathered all whom they found, both good and bad. So the wedding hall was filled with guests. But when the king came in to see the guests, he noticed a man there who was not wearing a wedding robe. And he said to him, 'Friend, how did you get in here without a wedding robe?' And he was speechless. Then the king said to the attendants, 'Bind him hand and foot, and throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen.'" Okay, that's our passage for this week. If you'd like to read it in a different translation, I'll stop talking, you hit pause, and we'll get back together in just a bit. One more time out if you want it. Hit pause again if you need a little time to reflect on what you've just heard, or to write down some notes or some questions. I'll be back in a moment. Quick word about the difference between a parable and an allegory. In most cases, the parables of Jesus seek to make one main point. They are really to be taken as a whole and should leave one lasting primary impression. An allegory, on the other hand, is a story in which each detail seems to connect with something else. This week's passage is called a parable, but it seems to have many features of an allegory too. If you were here with me last week, you may feel a sense of déjà vu when you hear this week's passage. Like the vineyard last week, the banquet can be thought of as the kingdom. And what happened to those who didn't behave well in the vineyard is duplicated by those who don't respond well to the invitation to the banquet. Those who issue the invitation on behalf of the king are the prophets, who are either ignored or mistreated or killed. And the burning of their city could be a look back to the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians, or a look ahead to the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans in AD 70. However you take it, together with the parables from the last 2 Sundays, the point of this one seems again to be that those who are now leading God's people are not doing the job they should, and serious measures need to be taken as a result. So, in the parable, a second attempt is made by the king to save the party he planned. Did you notice who filled the hall in verse 10? The translation I read to you, the New Revised Standard Version, has both good and bad. But if you read a different translation earlier, you might have found those words reversed, which is actually the order of the words found in the original Greek. And speaking of the bad, that Greek word that is translated bad in this passage is translated at least 4 different ways in Matthew's Gospel. So I'm going to give you a moment to pause the video and take time to look up at least as many as 3 other passages to see the different ways the same Greek word that's translated bad in this passage gets translated elsewhere. I'll be here when you get back, as always. So, the kingdom seems to be filled with the bad, the evil, the wicked, the unhealthy, as well as the good and the generous. That can't be the last word on the subject, can it? No. The last several verses, verses 11 through 14, make it clear that it is pretty easy to stay at the party. But if you want to get yourself kicked out of the party, that can be arranged. And you can get yourself kicked out with gusto. When the king comes in to see how the party is going, he sees someone who is not dressed appropriately. Now, the way Jesus tells this parable, it seems to suggest that this king provided garments to put on over whatever was originally worn to the party. So whether you were good and showed up with nice clothes, or you were bad and showed up with dirty clothes, let's say, everybody gets covered with the king's generosity, and everyone looks equal as a result. But if you choose not to wear what the king offers, it's a different story entirely. So in verse 11, when the king says, "Friend," and you have to know that that is not the same friend in the original that you'll find in places like where Jesus says in the Gospel of John, "I no longer call you servants, I call you friends." It's not that word. It's the same word that Jesus uses when Judas strolls into the Garden of Gethsemane, and Jesus says to him, "Friend, do what you are here to do." So it's friend with a way different connotation. He says to the guy, "Friend, how did you get in here without a wedding robe?" In other words, are you trying to suggest you're worthy to stand before me wearing your own goodness instead of that which I have offered you? And then it's very interesting what happens next. It says the man was speechless. He was silenced, which happens to be the same verb that is used when Jesus silences the demons. It's the same verb that is used when Jesus silences the raging Sea of Galilee in that boat that he had just been awakened in. So, the guy was silenced for his attempt to be received on his own merits, and the results of what happened to him are a caution to us. Many of those who are baptized wear white. Some of us wore white gowns that had been in our family for generations. I suspect this may have been the first time some of us guys wore what looked like a dress. And the white of that garment is an echo of the wedding robe in this parable. When we came out of the water of baptism, we were clothed with a goodness that is not our own, but is rather a gift from God because of Christ. At the other end of life's journey, when a casket is in the church for a funeral, it is always covered with a pall, a white cloth that becomes the bookend to our baptism. Just as we began this life covered with a sign of God's grace, so we leave this life in the very same way. It's really not my intention to have you thinking about your funeral already, but as you think ahead to Sunday's worship service and the teeter-totter, that image that I have suggested might guide our prayer, praise, and thanksgiving, what are you in most need of having God cover? I won't make this one a conversation question. I'll just leave that one out there for you to consider during the time between now and Sunday. On the other end of the teeter-totter is Thanksgiving. The Greek word for Thanksgiving is Eucharist, one of the names that we use for the Lord's Supper. We started this session talking about attending wedding receptions and their banquets. Holy Communion is something like a pre-reception. One of the images of heaven is that of a wedding banquet between Christ, the groom, and his bride, the church. And just as hors d'oeuvres are served before you're admitted to the main meal at an earthly wedding reception, our little taste of bread and wine are the appetizers, the foretaste of the heavenly feast to come. So as you prepare for worship this week and prepare to receive Holy Communion again, and as you remember that you've been covered with a wedding robe, courtesy of Jesus, feel free to take a little pause and consider some of those thoughts, words, and deeds you are especially thankful that God has covered. I didn't plan ahead of time to end each of these sessions by incorporating the words of a song or a hymn from our worship life, but it just happened that once again the words of a familiar old hymn came to mind as I got ready to conclude our time together. But instead of reading the text to you this time, I will not say anything, so you're free to sing along.